I think you and I talked around. Well, let me just pause. Kiram, do you have any questions?
No, this is great, great level of detail. I guess one question that I have is how does all these benefits translate into higher kilowatt hours per kilowatt or per watt of panel
Yeah.
over the lifetime of that panel or of a system?
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay. Ready? We're
how
gonna
do
do
you
a
guys
little.
think about that? Yeah.
Yeah, we'll do a little math together. So I'm gonna ask you a question, Kieran. What do you think most homeowners, if they're looking at panels, what's like kind of the thing that they probably all gravitate to first? What what thing is it that they're probably looking at?
The looks.
Okay, look is definitely important. You're right. You're absolutely right. So now it looks good. Check.
Or now you don't, yeah, exactly. It's gotta look slick.
Yeah,
And
no,
you guys do look slick. I know that. Uh,
and
and
then
then the next thing is maybe the first thing is having a good return on investment on the money they're paying.
that's exactly right. So they want to get a good ROI. And a lot of times they look at maybe just the wattage of the panel. They're like, oh, well, the higher the wattage, the more ROI I get out of this, right? Well, what's happening is as you get higher wattage, you're often also making that panel a little bit taller, or making that panel a little bit wider. You're just stretching out that panel. You're adding another half layer of cells, or maybe another full layer of cells to increase that wattage. But at Meyer Burger, we want to give you more without having to like get massively bigger. So now there's how do we do that, right? And that's ultimately what you're asking me. So watts absolutely one part of the equation. But the next thing we're going to look at is temperature coefficient. So temperature coefficient is how does your panel operate in high temperature environments. And a great analogy I like to use is, Karen, you've got your phone, you've got your cell phone, I've got my cell phone. We're both sitting at a little beer garden in the middle of July, and there's no umbrella around. The beer tastes great, but our phones are getting baked in the sun, right? And your phone eventually does what?
That's off.
Yeah, it turns off or powers down, or it's like, I can't do this, right? And the reality is my phone eventually is going to do the same. But temperature coefficient is measuring how quickly does your phone do that, or how quickly does that panel slow down production, and how quickly does our panel slow down production. And one of the areas that we win at is in that temperature coefficient. So in those high heat environments, while both panels, a standard panel and our panel, will both slow down, ours will never slow down as greatly or as deeply as our competitors. So temperature coefficient, but that alone doesn't solve it. So now we've got watts, we've got temperature coefficient, and one of the next things we're going to look at is degradation, right? So when we're considering degradation, it's just like any other major appliance that you would buy. All appliances over time will slow down. They will bog down. That's just the reality of equipment. What you need to pay attention to is how far and how quickly. And so on, I'd say a standard panel or average industry panel, what we're seeing is in that 80 to 85% range. So what does that mean? It basically means over the course of, typically speaking, 25 years, that panel will continue to operate at up to 80% or maybe 85% of its original capacity. With Meyer Burger, we're at that 92% mark. So our panel's degradation rate means that at year 25, we'll be operating at 92%. So year one,
That's like 0.25% per year degradation, which is impressive because I remember back in the early 2010s when I was developing a utility scale solar farm, we would assume like 1 to 2% first year and thereafter 0.5% per year of
yeah,
degradation. And so this is like less than half, maybe a third or a fourth of traditional degradation assumptions. Yeah. So
yeah, and
that's
it's important. And I think as if homeowners are listening to this, when you're looking at modeling
1%.
software and what people are projecting, year one is your ideal situation. Year one is great for literally everyone. Like any solar panel you pick out there, it's gonna look awesome year one. But really, what you want to be paying attention to is what is it over the life of the system? What happens at year 2 and 3 and 4? And what is that percentage drop that you just ripped off the top of your head calculation wise, right? Because that's the bigger purchase. It's not how great gas mileage does your car get year one. You didn't buy a car for 1 year. You bought a car for, maybe 10 years. How great gas mileage you get after 10 years. That's the way you need to think about solar panels. How great a production will I get after 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 25 years? And there's another part of the equation. So we've talked watts, we've talked temperature coefficient, we've talked degradation. Can also talk about the technology. So we touched briefly about smart wire, of course, and then the actual cell inside of there. So mono PERC, which is the industry average, but it's also the end of its life, right? We're just not going to get any better at mono PERC. It's not going to be any more awesome. We'll add different things. We'll add IBC to it. We'll add TopCon to it. We will do things to make it better, but the cell itself is like, man, it's had a great run, but it's time to move on, right? So we already moved on a while ago into heterojunction. And I talked a little bit about that before, but it's an N-type cell with amorphous silicon on both sides. And all said and done, it produces in lower light conditions. That's one of the ways it's producing more kilowatt hours. An example I like to give is if we both imagined a light bulb. We have a light bulb connected to a Meyer Burger panel and a light bulb connected to an industry average panel. And the sun started to rise in the morning. Well, our light bulb's going to turn on first, and a little bit later, theirs is going to turn on. And then all day long, both light bulbs shining bright, look great. But in the evening, when the sun starts to set, their light bulb will turn off first, and ours will stay on a little bit longer. And that has to do with using N-type heterojunction cell, where it's able to produce or grab more of the UV rays of the spectrum of the UV rays to start producing earlier, later, or in poor light conditions. So that's another aspect of it. And then, of course, efficiency. That's the last letter in all of the letters we've just worked through. But all of those things combined is how you get more kilowatt hours. And that's a lot of information. I would say at the end of the day, if you're a homeowner just listening, that's why kind of saying, hey, what's my 25-year production? And what's it when I'm looking at these two different panels? Just tell me my 25-year kilowatt hour production. That's important to me. Not necessarily watts alone, not necessarily how many panels, not necessarily degradation in isolation, but all of these things combined. Then look at the 25-year, and that's when you're going to find the decision becomes a lot easier. Then you'll know, okay, this is where my money, my ROI, as you said earlier, is actually giving me the bang for the buck.
Yeah. I mean, just the degradation, that is a 10 to 15% improvement on the lifetime production. And then everything else that you said, I'm sure it could add another 5-10%. That's, that's essentially one more extra year of payback. Like, if you assume most systems have a 3, 4, 5, sometimes 7, 8, 9 year payback,
Yeah.
that's a considerable amount that you are adding to the ROI. So
Absolutely. And for people who are really not staying in their homes that long anymore, that ROI, any time you can shorten it is super important. So yeah, I agree. Like, but you have to know the whole picture, because a year one snapshot doesn't tell enough of the story. You really do have to look at a year 25 snapshot to understand what you're buying, and then back into the decision you want to make for yourself.
so interesting. This is like, there are hundreds of millions, billions of consumers that buy cars, every 5-10 years. But there are only such a small percentage of people that actually know the pieces that go into the car and what makes a
Yeah.
Mercedes and another brand and that brand, like, so this is almost like understanding what makes a good solar panel. So thank you for that
Yeah,
lesson.
I do always like the car analogy. It to me, it's like it's so confusing. So what did the car industry do? For the most part, they show giant, big black letters and numbers that say the miles per gallon, right? And the thing that homeowners need to do is move away from, hey, what's the wattage of the panel? Because that's maybe the equivalent of saying, what size is your gas tank, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Instead, say, what's the equivalent of the miles per gallon? Well, that's how many kilowatt hours will I get out of this over the lifetime of the system. And and in most cases, we measure around that 25-year mark. So the educational part, which we talked about earlier, that's what I hope we see shift and change, is backing away from watts alone and educating. Because I'll tell you who's doing it is the C&I industry, right? Commercial and industrial are looking at those kilowatt hours, and they already know that's why our panels are in carport projects. Like, we got a lot of C&I using our 385 or 390 in projects because they get that part of the math. But that information and that education just hasn't made its way down to homeowners. And so we often get lost in the minutia of like, man, I've got a 420 watt panel. It's like, okay, well, what's the degradation on that bad boy, right? Or how's it going to do in high heat conditions? Or, all the things we just walked through. So yeah, hopefully that helps.